little bit from my courses as a Dominican, but when I was a seminarian in Madison, Wisconsin, there was an incredible psychologist, Dr. Robert Enright. He taught at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he spent his life researching forgiveness and learning about it and writing about it and studying it way before it was even popular. And this is at a secular university where a lot of his fellow psychologists would like give him a hard time for studying something that nobody else is, but he really stuck with it, dedicated his life to it, and he had a lot of insights that he's gained from it. So much of what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight comes from my reading his works, talking with him when I was in Madison, listening to his presentations that he gave to some of us seminarians. And it's really, really fruitful. And it's also very, very founded on the best psychological science today. So I hope you find it useful. There will be some practical things I get into, but the basic structure of this talk is going to be, first, I want to define very clearly what forgiveness is and make sure that we don't have any misunderstandings about forgiveness itself. And then I need to draw a distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation, because sometimes people confuse those two, but you got to be very clear that they're distinct things, forgiveness and reconciliation. Then the second half, I want to be much more practical and talk about the steps you need to go through in order to authentically forgive someone and reap the benefits from that forgiveness. That's a 4-step process, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, and but it's very, very helpful after we define it to see how you practically put it into action in your life. And then I want to conclude with 2 of the most common pitfalls people get stuck in when they're thinking about forgiving or trying to forgive. Those pitfalls will be much clearer after we define it and after we talk about a fruitful process of forgiveness. Then you'll be able to see those pitfalls a lot easier and maybe recognize them in yourself. So that's going to be my structure for this talk. Let me get my little slideshow up here. Okay, so forgiveness, healing the darkness of resentment. I had to get, of course, Advent wreath up here. We only have 2 lit so far, but that's how far we into it. But it's a great topic for Advent as well, because we're awaiting Christ and getting ready for it. And this is such a way to heal our souls. So first, the Our Father, right? We pray it at every single Mass. The line, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. That is how we can unlock so much fruitfulness and so much charity in our own life, by forgiving. Because when we forgive, when we experience God's forgiveness, it allows us to forgive. And it's this cycle of charity and fruitfulness. But it's a linchpin right at the heart of the prayer Jesus taught us. It's super, super important, right? If we pray, we're asking God to forgive us as we forgive those who trespass against us. We really, really, really have to make the effort to forgive those who have hurt us in the past. And now defining what forgiveness is, okay? Forgiveness is 2 things put together. The first is the foregoing of resentment or revenge when the wrongdoer's actions deserve it, okay? So it's letting go of that resentment, giving up the idea of revenge, not ruminating on ideas of revenge, even when the wrongdoer's actions deserve it, okay? And secondly, now this is the tough part. This one requires a lot of work, but giving the offender gifts of mercy, generosity, and love, even when the wrongdoer does not deserve them. Now, it seems like such an irrational virtue, forgiveness, right? Because we're saying we have to forget, we have to give up resentment even when they deserve it, and we have to offer them gifts even when they don't deserve them. But it's kind of like this divine paradox. It's supernatural charity in a sense, because just like Jesus on the cross, completely innocent, right? No wrongdoing, was able to pray, Jesus, forgive them, for they know not what they do, right? it's a complicated virtue, but forgiveness is these two things put together. Now, there's a lot of misunderstandings about forgiveness. Well, yeah, you got to remember this. And all three of the synoptic gospels, right? Jesus said, love your enemies. Matthew and Luke, twice in Luke, he says it. We have to love our enemies. We have to love our enemies. And forgiveness, partially because of how contradictory it seems, it can be a really long, difficult, and painful process. It's not something that you just decide to do and then suddenly it's over, because it's a very human virtue. It incorporates our emotions, it incorporates our memory, it incorporates our virtues and our sense of justice and our sense of what's right. And it can be a really long, difficult, painful process in order to work at it. That's why forgiveness really is a virtue. Now, we normally don't think of forgiveness as a virtue. We think of courage, right? Or these other types of virtues, justice, as virtues. But forgiveness is a virtue, and it takes effort to work at, and it takes practice, just like any other virtue. If you want to get good at something, if you want to get good at playing basketball or a sport, or if you want to get good at cooking a meal, right? It takes practice and effort and striving to become good at it. You have to think of forgiveness as a virtue, because it's a long process, and it can be very difficult depending on the intensity of the hurt that you suffer. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that it is not in our power not to feel or to forget an offense, but the heart that offers itself to the Holy Spirit turns injury into compassion and purifies the memory, and transforming the hurt into intercession. Now, this paragraph is just packed full of meaning, right? Because we can't choose not to feel something. We can't choose to forget something. That's not what forgiveness is, right? Rather, forgiveness is a virtue that transforms injury into compassion. It's a virtue that purifies the memory from resentment and transforms that hurt into intercession, intercessory prayer for our enemies, loving our enemies, praying for those who have hurt us. It's a virtue. It's long, difficult, and painful because it requires moving beyond the initial feelings and initial painful memories in order to transform them in imitation of Christ on the cross. Okay, now what forgiveness does not mean. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, right? You're not trying to forget that the offense occurred. You're not trying to just pretend it didn't ever exist. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Forgiveness also does not mean that you're condoning or excusing the offense. By forgiving someone, you're not saying, oh, it's okay what you did. That's not what forgiveness is at all. And if you have that misunderstanding, you think, oh, I can't forgive because what they did was an injustice. It was injustice, therefore. But forgiving is not excusing that injustice. That's not what it is. Forgiveness also does not mean renouncing. Renouncing efforts to obtain restitution or legal justice, right? Justice is still a virtue. We still need to pursue justice. And forgiving someone doesn't mean that we renounce the virtue of justice. Okay, and the last thing forgiveness does not mean, it does not mean suppressing. It doesn't mean that we no longer feel anger about what happened. It doesn't mean packing it all into a box and ignoring it. And sometimes when we hear people talk about forgiveness, and even sometimes how it's just taught to us when we're little children, right? It's like, oh, forgive your sister for what she did. And you got to go, oh, I forgive you. Okay, and then you walk away, but you haven't really forgiven them. It's because we're suppressing it, right? True forgiveness requires work. It requires effort. It requires a growth in virtue. So these are four things. You got to be very clear that forgiveness does not mean any of these four things. Second, four things that forgiveness does not require of the people who offended us. This is another place where people can make mistakes sometimes. Forgiveness does not require that the person who hurt us admit their offense. Sometimes we can get in the idea that, well, I can't forgive because they won't admit they're wrong, right? But no, you're confusing two different things going on at the same time there. If you want to focus on forgiveness itself as one of your virtues, right? Our souls have all these different virtues that we're working on all the time. We're working on compassion. We're working on humility. We're working on justice. We're working on courage, right? To stand up for what's right. And these are personal moral virtues that we work at in our own soul. And forgiveness is one of those type of virtues. And just like all those other virtues don't require other people outside of us to give us the opportunity, same thing with forgiveness. To forgive someone, it doesn't require that somebody admit their offense. And second, it doesn't require that the offender ask for forgiveness. We can forgive someone even if they don't ask for our forgiveness. And the third thing is restore. It doesn't require that the person who hurt you restore what happened, right? That they make appropriate restitution. Because the fact of the matter is, it's impossible. Most of the time, I would say, and in certain cases, absolutely impossible to make restitution for something that somebody does. Look at the extreme case, right, of murder. Like, if someone's child is murdered by somebody else, there is no way that other person could make appropriate restitution for what had happened. But you see cases, there are cases where people forgive even a horrible offense like that. Now, again, it's long, it's difficult, it's a painful process. They're working at it their entire life probably, but it's a virtue you're striving to imitate Christ in. Third thing, forgiveness does not require that offenders change, okay? They don't have to be willing to able to change their offensive ways. Sometimes it's impossible. Sometimes people are just stuck in their evil habits that led to a particular offense, and they're just incapable of change. So none of these things are required of the offender. The person who hurt you in whatever way it was, you can't cling to your unforgiveness, your resentment, and your anger with the excuse of saying, well, they need to ask for forgiveness first, or they got to admit that they were wrong, or they got to make it right somehow. These are all excuses you're running through in your mind because you're confusing different virtues. You're confusing the virtue of forgiveness with the virtue of justice, or you're confusing two things. But if you're really clear on what forgiveness actually is, it doesn't require that the offender do any of these four things. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about reasons why we personally might choose not to forgive. Like I have heard people say this, well, I do not want to forgive this person. And I think there's four reasons we have for not even trying to forgive. So the first is attention, like the attention or influence you get from having been offended. It's kind of like the victim complex in a sense. And I don't know how many of you were at Mass a couple weekends ago, about 10 days ago, when I preached a little bit, mentioned forgiveness, mentioned my father and his younger brother, and how they had some type of falling out before I was born, such that my dad had a really hard time forgiving his younger brother for something that happened, right? Well, while I was growing up, I kind of saw how this brought attention to my dad. They're like, oh, we can, like, he would be at McDonald's with all his friends in the morning having coffee, right? And some of his friends would just needle him because, you know, sometimes our friends just like to push our buttons, right? Some of his friends would push my dad's button about the hurt that his younger brother did to him. Like they would push the button that my dad hadn't forgiven his younger brother. And it would bring some attention to my dad, right? So this, I don't know, it's a weird thing, but the victim mentality, having been hurt by somebody, can bring an attention that we kind of like, and we gotta break from that. It's not good. It's not a good not a good thing to have that type of attention. Okay. The second is sometimes we can cling to not forgiving because it gives us power, the type of power that you can feel. And this one I've seen, I guess, most frequently in marriages, that I've been friends with different people who are married, and one of the spouses will hold some mistake that the other spouse had done at some previous point over their head, as if it gave them some type of power in the relationship. Like, I'm not going to forgive you because that thing you did gives me power over you. Okay, that's also not good. It's not healthy. You have to be careful of that. The third is it helps us escape from the emotional pain. And this choosing not to forgive in this sense, in a sense, it's when you recognize the injustice of what happened and how you were hurt, focusing on the injustice of it or focusing on different aspects of it lets you escape from the emotional pain that's an inherent part of forgiving someone. If you're going to fully forgive someone, you have to be honest and transparent with yourself regarding that emotional pain. And sometimes people just aren't emotionally mature enough to handle that emotional pain, so they can't take that step towards forgiveness. And so they cling to not forgiving someone to avoid feeling that emotional pain. Another reason we might not try to forgive, that we may avoid forgiveness, is just because of depression. When we have been hurt, that depression, it kind of comes from harboring resentment. And it's this downward cyclical spiral. We're depressed because we've been hurt, we've lost a loved one, something bad happened, and we get depressed. And then in that depression, we harbor and focus on that resentment. And it's kind of this mental trap that we lock ourselves into, this cage where we can't get out because the depression and the resentment feed off each other. Okay. These are 4 reasons I've recognized in talking to people and reading that people will cause people to cling to not forgiving. But we have to recognize that these are not good reasons. These are not good reasons. You have to move beyond these 4 excuses, if you will, in order to experience the fullness of forgiveness. Now, another quote from the Catechism. Now, this blew my mind when I first read this. This is paragraph 2844, if you want to look it up. First, it says, forgiveness is a high point of Christian prayer. Wow. Like, I don't think of forgiveness as prayer, but that's what the Catechism Church says forgiveness is. And again, look at Christ on the cross, right? One of his 7 last words, forgive them for they know not what they do. Forgiveness is a high point of Christian prayer. And only hearts attuned to God's compassion can receive the gift of prayer. In the same paragraph, immediately afterward, there's nothing in between these 2 sentences, it says, forgiveness also bears witness that in our world, love is stronger than sin. So this virtue of forgiveness, it's an incredibly powerful evangelization tool in a sense, showing people the love of Christ, forgiving someone. You've heard the stories of people in the courtroom where there's just been some horrible injustice that has happened, and the person who's been hurt openly forgives the person who hurt them. And that forgiveness just touches everybody's heart. Everybody sees that, and you just get a glimpse of the love of God when that happens. It's so beautiful, and it's so courageous, and it's so heroic. And you're like, how can somebody do that in that situation? But it's because forgiveness bears witness that in our world, love is stronger than sin. Love is stronger than sin. Okay. Now, I've been talking a lot about forgiveness and what it's not. And in order to make that solid, I think we got to have a distinction here between forgiveness and reconciliation. Now, reconciliation is something beyond forgiveness. It's moving beyond forgiveness because it's bringing the other person into the picture in an effort to restore a relationship. Okay. Now, reconciliation is great, but it's not always possible. And so you have to make that distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation. Reconciliation requires things beyond forgiveness. First, the offer of forgiveness by the offended. You have to offer the other person your forgiveness. And then second, the acceptance of the gift of forgiveness by the offender. And finally, the ability of both parties to reestablish mutual trust. So you can see how, whereas forgiveness is a virtue that you're working on in your own soul in order to let go of resentment and grow in the strength to offer love in response to an injustice, reconciliation is repairing of a relationship, okay? Because in that sense, yes, you have to offer the forgiveness and the other person has to accept the forgiveness, and then you have to reestablish a mutual trust. Now, there are many cases where this just isn't even an option. It's not even on the table. Like think of somebody, for example, who was abused as a child and now the person who hurt them is dead, right? Or no longer around. There's no possibility of reconciliation in that case because the offending party isn't even there. But that does not mean that that person cannot forgive the person who hurt them. That it's something different, and it's really important to recognize the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation between two people, okay? So yeah, genuine forgiveness need not and sometimes ought not result in reconciliation. I'll just leave it at that. You have to have that distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation because there are some cases where you should choose not to be reconciled if the offending party has a chance to hurt you again. For instance, another example would be an abusive relationship, right? Where one of the partners is physically abusive repeatedly to the other partner. Now, you don't want to, if it's a habitual thing that's taken place time and time again, you can't restore that relationship. But after the parties have been separated, there has to be a point where the person who was hurt does forgive the other person. Okay, anyway, I hope that distinction helps some people. Now let's move on to more practical. Let's talk about the four phases of actually forgiving somebody. And there's four, you can find different psychologists who present this in different ways. This is the one that I find most fruitful because it keeps them very discreet, and it's just the simplest and most helpful for me. And the first phase is uncovering. The second phase is a decision phase. Third is the work phase. This is where the long, difficult, painful process really, the rubber hits the road. And then fourth is the deepening phase. So let me talk a little bit about the uncovering phase. What does that mean? The uncovering phase means there's three subparts to it, if you will. First, you got to confront and clarify the nature of the offense, which means determining as objectively as possible who did what to whom. In a sense, you got to turn off your feelings for a second, look at it from an outsider's perspective, and just be very, very non-dramatic, right? Sometimes in our own head, we can just get caught up in the drama and we can exaggerate and we see things from our perspective and it just gets blown so out of proportion. The very important part of the uncovering phase is looking at the offense as objectively as possible and being very, very, very clear about the wrong that was done. Because sometimes we can just throw things on top of things and it becomes this garbage hill. And if the relationship it's a really long relationship. Somebody's been married for 10 years, for instance. The offenses can just build and build and build and build. And then you get in an argument and you're bringing up all these different past offenses that have no bearing on each other, and your emotions just get way out of whack. Well, if you're going to actually forgive a particular offense, a particular wrong that was done, you have to be very clear objectively about that wrong, with no drama attached to it. Okay. Second, during this uncovering phase, you also have to uncover the consequences of having been offended. Now, this also includes the subjective harm or injuries caused by the offense, right? The first part, when you're just being, this is what was done that was wrong, exactly, objectively, this is it. Well, the second part carries with it all the emotional baggage that wasn't part of the objective wrong, right? This is important in the uncovering phase because you want to be healed at the deepest level. You want to be healed emotionally and spiritually, and not just legally, So this is also an important part of the uncovering phase. And then that leads to this third part, becoming aware of the emotional pain from an offense. You have to acknowledge feelings of anger or hatred, even if the offense is legitimately that big and that great of an injustice. I mean, that's anger, right? Even St. Thomas Aquinas says the true injustice, the appropriate response is a just anger. You have to acknowledge these feelings. You can't be bottling them up. All of this is part of the uncovering phase. And again, remember those 4 reasons why people may choose not to forgive. One of them was they just didn't want to deal with the emotional pain. It's because they don't want to do the second and third part of the uncovering phase. But all 3 of these are important part of uncovering the depth and the pain of the offense. But you can't stay here. You have to move on to the next phase. The next phase is the decision phase. The first, you got to realize that what you've been doing is not working. This is part of what helped me in my conversation with my dad, helping him forgive his younger brother. I'm like, Dad, you've been angry at him my entire life. It's not working. It just is not working. Recognize that fact, Dad, please. And so once you recognize that, that's the first part of the making the decision you want to forgive. And then you also have to gain an accurate understanding of the nature of forgiveness. Now, thank you for coming to this talk. That's what I'm trying to do here, is help give you a really clear understanding of the nature of forgiveness. Deciding to commit to forgiving based on this understanding. You can't just decide to forgive based on a misconception of it. But if you have a really clear understanding of it, you make the decision based on that clear understanding. And then forgiveness is and must be freely chosen. You can't force someone to forgive. Even if your mom tried to force you to forgive your brother when you were younger, as toddlers, it can't be. Authentic forgiveness must be freely chosen, because it has to be the whole of our person that forgives in order for the whole of our person to be freed of that pain. Okay. The next phase is the work phase. This one, there's going to be a whole other slide on the work phase coming up after we get through these, because this is where the rubber hits the road, really. And it's day after day after day of working towards forgiveness. And it's working on forgiving. We must first think differently if we are to feel differently. We have to change our habits of thought. The ruts we get stuck in our thinking, those need to change. We can't be ruminating all the time on the hurt and the injustice and what was wrong with it. We have to, in order to work on forgiving, we have to first think differently. And so here are different ways you can do that in the work phase. Gain a cognitive understanding of the offender, right? This is difficult, but in a sense, it's putting yourself in the offender's shoes and trying to do vicariously the first two steps that we just talked about, looking at it from the offender's view. Like, what was their childhood like? Where did they come from? Where did they grow up? Have they been hurt like that their whole life? Did they learn this behavior from somebody else? It's trying to think through from the offender's perspective. And that can help you view the offender in a new light. Now, you have to be careful. Remember, way back at the beginning, I said forgiveness is not excusing or condoning the wrong, right? This process is not doing that. And sometimes you can trick yourself into thinking you're doing that by saying, well, if I put myself in their shoes, it wasn't really their fault because they were brought up horribly and all these other things. And so now I'm excusing their behavior. No, that's not what you're doing. And that's partially why the uncovering phase has to come first. So you have a very clear sense of the injustice that was done. But you also have to have the mental agility to view it from their perspective, right? God, just like God knows all of us better than we even know ourselves. He knows everything about us, right? In a sense, in this phase, we're trying to pray to God, God, help me see things from my offender's perspective, right? Help me see him as you do so that I can forgive him the way you forgave your killers from the cross. That's what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to excuse or make excuses for the offense. And concrete actions. More details to come on another slide. But you have to do concrete actions to work towards forgiveness. Because right up here, right? Working on forgiveness, we must first think differently if we are to feel differently, right? And that leads to acting differently. It's this cascade of thinking to feeling to acting. It's a process, just like any other virtue, right? If you want to be humble, you have to stop thinking proud. You got to stop acting proud, and you got to stop doing proud actions. You got to make the whole transition to thinking humble thoughts, to feeling humble, to acting humble, right? All three of those are important parts in any virtue. And forgiveness is just like any other virtue in that regard. Beneficence cannot be rushed or demanded and may take a long time to achieve. So if you remember at the very beginning, when I first laid out what forgiveness is, many of you may have been like, well, I don't know about that second part, right? Really offer gifts of compassion and love to the offender even when they don't deserve it. That's hard. Long, difficult, painful process, right? And so beneficence, it can't be rushed or demanded. It may take a long time. You have to be patient at working through this process and developing this virtue. And finally, the heart of forgiveness is accepting the pain, right, from the uncovering phase, and choosing not to pass it on. Accepting the pain and choosing not to pass it on. Okay, now I'll get back to this concrete actions later, but first I want to talk about the final phase so we can get all four phases kind of in one whole thing so you can see how it all fits together. The deepening phase. Now, I'm talking about all four of these phases, right? But it's not like a step 1, 2, 3, 4. That's why I didn't number them. You're always going to be like moving back and forth between them in a kind of fluid manner, and you're going to be working. Ideally, you want to work with one individual objective injury that was done to you, right? The more focused you are on a particular objective thing that hurt you, the easier it is to forgive the person. If it's a whole ball of a bunch of different offenses, you'll just get lost in the second uncovering phase. You have to focus on one particular one, and you're going to be moving back and forth. The deepening phase gives you two results: release and positive experiences. This is where forgiveness bears fruit in your life. It releases you from the emotional prison of unforgiveness, of the bitterness, of the resentment, of the anger, all those painful, dark, depression-inducing feelings that clinging to unforgiveness can lead to. Those will finally just be released as your forgiveness deepens, and it will bear positive experiences of having increased meaning in the suffering, redemptive suffering. You'll feel more connected with others because through the work phase and recognizing things from other people's perspectives, right? You'll experience decreased negative affect, right? Your affections, your emotions won't be this painful negative neutron star of bitterness and resentment, but those will be lessened as you make progress in the virtue of forgiveness. And you'll have a renewed purpose in life. You won't be clinging to this martyr complex or this victim mentality. And that helps you have a positive, objective purpose and a renewed life and fire in your belly, if you will. So these deepening phase, it's kind of like the fruit of the tree of forgiveness, where all these bad things are released and all these good experiences, positive experiences you start having, okay? Okay, now let's go back to the work phase a little bit. I want to talk a little bit more about some concrete work phase actions that we can do. Now, I mentioned this first one. This is kind of uncovering phase a little bit, but it also fits into the work phase, working towards an accurate understanding of the offender. It takes effort to think through their perspective or what caused it, right? Second, another very effective concrete action you can do is reframing or rethinking the offensive situation. Sometimes we get offended from what somebody did and they have no idea, right? Sometimes it's just because of the situation and how it was framed that it feels like it was offensive. I can think of one example of that in my own life, right? There was a point where I was working on my dissertation and I was working really hard, and I was in the midst of it where I felt like there's no way I could ever finish this thing. I'm just not smart enough. I can't do it, right? And at the time, a friend of mine, because he just wanted to share a story with me to try and encourage me, he was telling me a story about how, when he was in grad school, there was this other grad student who shouldn't have been there, and the professor said that. Anyway, I heard the story as if he were calling me one of the students who were incapable of doing that, right? And so it really hurt. But it's just because of how I took the situation. Looking at it from his perspective, trying to encourage me, telling the story, reframing the situation, rethinking the offensive situation. This is work we can do for less grievous offenses, because sometimes we just mishear someone or misinterpret the way that it was expressed. Anyway, that's another very helpful concrete work phase thing, is just to reframe the situation. Maybe it's not as offensive as you thought it was. Okay, seeing the offender from a new perspective, right? You combine these first two here, working towards an accurate understanding of the offender and reframing the situation. Those help you see the offender from a new perspective. Working toward realistic empathy and compassion for the offender. Courageously and assertively bearing the pain caused by the offense. Now this is, in a sense, taking Christ as your model on the cross, where you're like, this was a horrible thing that was done to me. I am suffering incredibly because of it, but I am going to courageously and assertively choose to bear this pain, right? I'm going to pick up my cross with Christ, and be courageous and assertively bear the pain, and giving the offender the moral gift of forgiveness. Now, they may not want it, they may not ask for it, but in your own mind, recognizing that it is a moral gift that you are giving also helps us in that working phase, right? Sometimes that's the first gift you're capable of giving, right? Recognizing that because of all these reasons, forgiveness is something that I am deciding I'm going to work towards. And at a point, you can't offer love and compassion and all these things yet because you're like, no, they hurt me too much. But sometimes the first gift that you can really give is like forgiveness. I'm going to do this. I'm going to make that choice. I'm going to do it. And so it can be the on-ramp to offering other gifts. Oh, no. Okay. Okay, there we go. Now, finally, I want to conclude here with two common pitfalls. The two most common pitfalls, I think, both happen during the uncovering phase. The first one is forgiving prematurely by skipping the uncovering phase. These are people who are just like, okay, I forgive you, right? But it doesn't, you can't just say the words and make it magically happen. Like if there was a real injustice there and there was something that was twisted and got wrong and things got messed up, right? You got to clean up the process. You have to take time to look at that uncovering phase. You have to take it to prayer. You have to ask Christ. You have to ask Virgin Mary. You have to ask the Holy Spirit to give you the grace to see and heal that injustice, heal that pain, right? If you just skip the uncovering phase, then in a sense, you're just packing it away in the back. And it's going to pop out and you're going to injure people the way you've been injured, right? The whole point of forgiveness is to break that cycle of passing on the pain that people have given you, break that cycle of inflicting pain and hatred. We have to break that cycle. And if you skip that uncovering phase, then you're not breaking the cycle. You may be breaking it consciously, but you're still going to be causing that pain because you haven't courageously and heroically chosen to bear the pain yourself so that you don't have to try and pass it on. Another very common pitfall, it's kind of the opposite of this first one. It's becoming stuck in the uncovering phase. Sometimes people just get stuck in the uncovering phase and it's not a phase for them. It's where they are perpetually at, thinking about the offense, thinking about all the perspectives of the offense, thinking about the offender's perspective, thinking about how they've been hurt emotionally, thinking about how all their relationships have been hurt, thinking about how all the people in their life have been hurt by the offense that they experienced at the hand of this other person. And they get stuck in this uncovering phase to such a degree that they never move beyond it to the work phase where they actually start building up a virtue of forgiveness in their heart. I think both of these are very common. I think different people have personalities that incline them towards one pitfall over the other, but they're both pitfalls, and both people who are stuck in these pitfalls are preventing themselves from experiencing the fullness of what forgiveness offers, right? None of these people who are in those two pitfalls are going to experience the deepening phase of the release of all these emotions or the positive effects, the positive experiences that come from developing true forgiveness in your soul. So be careful of these. You don't want to get stuck in that uncovering phase. It's very easy to do. Another way I think it's helpful to avoid those two is if you go back to the uncovering phase, the very first one, determining as objectively as possible who did what to whom. I think doing that first helps you keep the uncovering phase contained in a sense, so that you can move beyond it when you need to work phase. It's the second two, like people are afraid of the feelings, so they just ignore the uncovering phase. That's the first pitfall, or they just get stuck in the feelings in these two parts of the uncovering phase, and then they just never get out of it. But those, I think, are the two most common pitfalls. Okay, and finally, I told you at the very beginning of this, I introduced it by saying I learned so much from Dr. Robert Enright in University of Wisconsin-Madison, who spent his life studying forgiveness. If you want to read more deeply into this, here are two of his books that I think are fantastic. Forgiveness is a Choice, the first one. I have it right here in front of me right now. This one is the more practical one. So if you have a particular hurt in your life that you're thinking of right now that you realize has been just causing resentment for years, this is the book to pick up because it's a very practical step-by-step guide with many real-life examples from other people with the names changed and all that, of course. But this one's the very practical one. This is great, step-by-step guide. If you want a bigger picture, understanding how forgiveness fits into a system of virtue ethics, Dr. Robert Enright did that in another book called The Forgiving Life. That one's fantastic. It's talking about living a life where forgiveness is one of your virtues that you're helping other people and teaching and learning. Anyway, these are two great books. If you want to dive deeper into this, I suggest these two. These are great. And yeah, thank you. That's what I wanted to say. And now if anybody has any questions or comments, just raise your hand and we can, yeah, I'll try to do the best I can. Okay, Ken?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really great. This first question is one that maybe kind of too big to deal with here, but this presentation's been about forgiving others.
Yeah.
What about forgiving yourself? You know, having resentment towards yourself.
Yeah, that's true. That's a great question. I didn't bring that up, but it is super important. You have to, forgiving yourself. Some people are so hard on themselves. And I think, I think in order to forgive yourself, it's really important to experience the forgiveness of God. When you hear about Jesus and what he did to save us, even in the midst of our sin, right? Having an experience of being forgiven is a key component of being able to forgive yourself, because feeling the love of God, experiencing the forgiveness of God makes you recognize that you are worth divine love and divine forgiveness. So I think that's important. But if you want to just get very practical, I think, again, in this uncovering phase, if there's something that you don't want to forgive yourself about, the first part I think is really important up here. Just being as objectively as possible who did what to whom. Again, because sometimes we, in our own mind, dramatize things so much. Like, we may be never forgiving of ourselves for something that may not even be that bad. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes we do horrible, horrible sins, and we don't want to let go of it.
It's only something that I did myself. Yeah. Okay. I mean, it didn't hurt anyone else, only hurt me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Dang. It is, I don't know how to answer this right now.
That's okay.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. Forgiving yourself for a wrong you've done, you have to recognize that God loves you. That's the key, and that God forgives you. Because if it's just you and yourself not forgiving yourself, you got to let God into that inner dialogue, so that it's a dialogue going on in your head about the offense. rather than it is just you beating yourself up for the offense. Yeah. And recognizing, I guess, it's also important. Maybe this would help. This would help. It certainly helped me. Here we go. Very practical help and bit of advice. I know in my own mind, I needed to understand that a virtue was not innocence, that I wasn't a saint just because I never did anything wrong. That being a saint means getting out there and doing charitable deeds, taking care of people, helping the world become a better place, and being this virtuous ball of activity that's loving and helping people, you know? And before, when I thought of sanctity as never sinning, right? I would beat myself up a lot more, right? Like if I did something wrong, then I would not forgive myself about it because now I messed up, and that's always going to be there because I can't go back in time and change history, right? But when I recognize that no, the purpose of life is to continually grow in virtue. So of course I did the horrible thing in my past, but I've grown since then, and I hope I won't make that same mistake because I've learned from it. And recognizing it as a mistake I made and that I learned from, and I moved on, and I'm growing in holiness and virtue and sanctity because I want to be in heaven someday. And so I think what really helped me with forgiving myself, I had a hard time with it when I was younger, and I think it's the transition to recognizing that becoming good, becoming a better person, becoming virtuous is a process. And so now I kind of the opinion that if I can't look back at myself 3 years ago and think I was a complete idiot 3 years ago, then I'm not growing enough. Like I always need to feel like I used to not know what was going on. Because if I'm doing that, then I'm growing. But I can't beat myself up for the mistakes I made back then. Like I think back to my diet and what I ate when I started college. Oh my gosh, I was an idiot. I ate horrible, horrible things. But I don't know. I don't know. Maybe that's helpful for learning to forgive yourself.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Sue Conley. If you can, yeah.
Sorry, my unmute wasn't going. So I have a situation where I'm trying so hard to forgive something, and I keep thinking I have, yet wrestling with how to like. And again, I love how you say it's not forgive or forget, you know, because you can't remember like a series of things or whatever. But when this particular person continually does bad things to family or whatever, like how do you forgive yet allow healthy boundaries so that the injury or the abuse or whatever doesn't occur again? Like protection versus forgiveness, and it gets all tangled. And you know, this is not our immediate family, but it's someone in our outer circle who is not a safe person. But I'm struggling because I keep trying to forgive, but they're not safe, and not safe to many of us. And I don't know what to do. So I feel like I don't want to have this be a thorn in my heart of my relationship with Jesus, where like I've had my protections. I've tried to protect family members from this person, and yet, and it doesn't end, you know, it'll never end, I don't think, you know. So forgiveness and protection, how does that work practically, where, you know, you're not banishing this person to a desert island?
Right.
And it's anybody knows here at all. It's not immediate family at all.
Yeah. Okay. What I want to say about this, I'm going to go back to this slide here. Forgiveness does not mean. This third one here, renouncing efforts to obtain restitution or legal justice. I think this is important because if it's, in a sense, you know, we have the distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation, right? And if this is a person who you can never be reconciled with because they're just perpetually dangerous in the sense of causing injustice and hurt, you can't cut them off because they are part of the circle, right?
Right.
So in this case, I think it's really important to not renounce efforts to obtain justice in that situation. Like if he is doing something repeatedly, you and the other people that he's offended in the situation need to hold him accountable for when that happens again, right? You have to put justice as the forefront there and call him out every single time that happens, right? It may be so habitual that it's never going to change, but maybe you can come up with some just penalty for whatever the action is. Like, you do this again, you are not getting invited to the next Christmas party, okay? That's not completely cutting them off, saying you're not part of the family anymore, but there has to be, like, if you want this, if this relationship is going to continue to be there, if it's not a situation where the right thing to do is to cut off the relationship, then you have to work at the relationship like any other relationship to try and make it healthy, which requires justice and requires like restitution to help the situation become more healthy. Now, you're right, it's difficult. And that's partially why families have the most painful situations and the happiest situations all rolled into one ball. And it is difficult, but I think that's what I would say about that situation. You have to really be clear that forgiving does not mean renouncing efforts to try and strive for justice and making sure that it doesn't happen again. And creating the boundaries.
Is avoidance permissible just for the sake of peace and safety? Just try to avoid situations with this person? I mean,
it might be. I mean, I don't know all the details of the situation, but you got to be careful not to fall into passive aggressiveness. That's never healthy. You want to be assertive with the justice, and you want to be clear, because in a sense, forgiveness is a gift you're giving him, but you have to make it clear to him that if we want this situation to be healthy and you're making it unhealthy repeatedly and habitually, you need to work at it. Right? You have to be clear in that regard.
Thanks.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else have a question? Yay. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for being here, and I really enjoyed giving this talk. I hope it was helpful.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. God bless everyone.
Thank you, Father. Thank you, Brother Dean. This is Bobby.
Oh, Bobby, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you,
Good night,
you
everyone.
too.
Have a nice evening.
Night.
Okay.
Night.
Night, everyone.